Everyone okay? So welcome back to this session on AI in society and legal aspect. And so let's start with our first speaker, so Miranda Cross. She will present a paper about limitation of transparency, democratizing, and regulating algorithm management.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Miranda. I just finished my master's at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'm now working at the Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Data Science and AI Foundation, doing public policy work. And this paper came out of my kind of broader management, which was looking at ways of countering the harmful effects of algorithmic management at work. And so for this conference, the concept of democratizing, I wanted to talk about some of the limitations in existing frameworks of fairness, accountability, and transparency, specifically in a work context. So algorithmic management is software algorithms that assume managerial functions and institutional devices that support those algorithms in practice. So we're talking both about the algorithms themselves that make the decisions, as well as the underlying capturing of employee data. They are used, I think they most extensively have been written about in the gig economy and also in like freight and warehouses, but more and more we see these types of technologies being used in so-called white-collar professions. Supposedly those who implement algorithmic management systems tout benefits like accuracy and efficiency, scalability, less biased decision-making, which is heavily disputed. But there are very clear drawbacks, including increased surveillance, which leads to dissociation and dehumanization, a mission creep of surveillance that's conducted at work that can bleed into other areas of life. So if you're an employee and your communications are being surveilled, supposedly in a work context, that kind of surveillance can very easily creep into other aspects of your life. Secrecy surrounding these systems and bias. Algorithmic management, it's been through this really interesting transformation in the literature over the past couple years, where at first we saw that it was just the outsourcing or complete taking over of decisions by these algorithms, and now it's used and viewed a little bit more as a tool which human managers use or can choose to outsource to. So, but it's very common, it's very prevalent, and it's a very broad definitional topic. I can skip this slide because Elizabeth just gave a phenomenal presentation on this. But basically, the transparency comes out of, the reason I wanted to focus on transparency was because of this design movement of FAT-ML or FACT-ML, fairness, accountability, and transparency. Transparency, of course, most commonly operationalized as explainable AI, which is focusing on humanly understandable inputs and outputs, which allows for external auditing, assessments of fairness and bias. The way that we see this come up in the literature a lot of the times is in hiring algorithms. So there's been a pretty large body of work done on studying the efficacy and bias of algorithms which screen candidates for job hiring. But of course, as we'll get into, I think this is not a panacea. There are definitely limitations with this as a design framework, and especially a lot of emphasis is placed on transparency as a design feature, specifically because the kind of common conception of algorithms as a black box has been really pervasive. Democratization of AI, as I said, we just heard a lot about this. But the end goal, of course, being that the decisions around questions like AI use and development reflect the will and preferences of the people that are impacted. So here, I chose to focus on the governance of AI. Workers themselves can't use these management algorithms. They also don't develop them, and they don't profit from them. So we only really, in this context, when you're talking about what workers themselves can only focus on how they're being governed and used at work. And the end goal is, of course, that the affected workers would have increased decision-making over whether or not they're subject to these kind of algorithms, more knowledge about what these outputs that are produced are, and the ability to freely opt out of usage. And the implementation here of democratic processes are key. But it's very antithetical, and this is why I wanted to focus on work, is because the implementation of democratic processes at work is very difficult. The worker and employer hierarchy is very ingrained. The ways that you manage those things are through things like unions, through collective action. But there isn't, in many workplaces, at the end of the day, a way for workers to exert their voices over the decisions that are made by managers or by higher-ups. It's just not how it works, and the stakes are very high, because if you do choose to speak up or disagree, you're losing your job, and that's your livelihood. So I thought that work, when we talk about the AI field permeating every sector of life, I wanted to narrow my focus on work because of the mediation of this worker-employer relationship. So the way that I did this was with a sociological framework called self-determination theory, which is used to understand why worker dissatisfaction is both detrimental to firms as well as workers themselves. So basically what SDT says is that there are three kinds of things that people need for intrinsic motivation. So self-motivation, whether that be at work or in a lot of other contexts. And those are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And the satisfaction of needs then leads to intrinsic motivation, higher performance, higher well-being, higher satisfaction. SDT is used in a lot of different contexts. They use it it is prevalent in organizational literature, but it's also prevalent in relational literature and a lot of other fields of sociology. But one of the things that was really interesting to me is that SDT pretty well mirrors some of the things that are necessary for democratization as well. The needs mirror fundamental rights that are key in governance. They contribute to individual agency and decision-making, which is a pretty key part of participation in a democratic society. And the argument that underlies the paper is that transparency doesn't wholly contribute to the satisfaction of these three needs at work. So a little more on the needs themselves. So autonomy is individuals need to act with a sense of ownership of their behavior and feel psychologically free to act with choice. So autonomy is all about making decisions, feeling that you have the agency and choice to make your own decisions. Competence is the ability to feel a sense of mastery over your environment and develop new skills. And relatedness is the need to see yourself as a member of a group and experience and sense of communion and develop close relations. So these are the three things that arguably within this framework, satisfaction of these three needs leads to intrinsic motivation. If you feel like your choices are your own, you're competent at what you do, and that you're a part of a group, you will be intrinsically motivated to perform well. So I take each one of these in turn and talk about why transparency doesn't necessarily address both the satisfaction of the need, but also the link between that need and democratization. So first being autonomy, transparency doesn't solve this problem of the loss of autonomy because of that imbalance of power that I talked about between employers and their employees. Even if you know that you're being subject to surveillance, being subject to algorithmic management, you can't freely consent to it in the current way that these relationships are structured. Because the consequence of withholding your consent, I mean, essentially it can range anywhere from you don't get a promotion to you lose your job, or your manager doesn't like you and that leads to all kinds of other downstream effects. And then loss of autonomy is in direct conflict with democratization because the freedom of choice is a fundamental tenet of being a participant in a democratic society. So if you yourself feel coerced or you feel like you can't freely make your own choices, how can you participate in a democratic society? That's the whole point of underlying, right, of voting, of participatory societies. So transparency does not necessarily lead to the democratization of AI at work, because just knowing that you're subject to algorithmic decision-making and understanding its outputs doesn't necessarily mean that you get to choose whether or not you're being subject to this. I think there's a really good example here in the gig economy. So if you are a delivery driver, you know that you are subject to an algorithm that assigns you rides or assigns you food deliveries, right? You are aware of this. It is in the app. You've consented, in theory, to it. You know what the outputs are, which is that it's picking certain types of food delivery routes for you or setting your pay. But that doesn't necessarily, that knowledge, that insight into what's going on in the algorithm doesn't necessarily make you feel like you have the autonomous choice to consent or not. And in the traditional workplace, where you aren't opting in the same way that you are in the gig economy, it's even more, I think, important to understand that if we want to democratize the use of these types of algorithmic management, it can't just be that we make them transparent, we make their outputs transparent. So secondarily, algorithmic management and their underlying surveillance interrupt skill building pathways at work. The example that I give is that managers can't necessarily develop their own management experience, because if you are subject to a productivity tracking algorithm, that algorithm then outputs, statistics about your productivity or statistics about your work to your manager. They're not directly observing you, nor are they giving you feedback. It's limiting their ability to develop that kind of relational experience, which we will also talk about later. The other thing is that employees a lot of the times can't track their performance and skills development. There's no manager that you can go talk to and say, hey, how am I doing if your outputs or what you're doing at work is being evaluated by an algorithm? And the traditional markers of performance are also disrupted because algorithms rarely provide individual feedback, and a lot of the times in certain settings, right, things like wage setting, it's not based on your performance, it's based on demand. So how can you feel competent at work when how much you get paid is determined by how many people want your service at a particular time, not how well you're doing that service? The other thing, and I think this is the most important, is that the lack of redress for these types of decisions makes workers feel like they are less competent, and it also gives them less incentive to develop skills. If you feel like you've been subject to a decision made by an algorithm at work that you feel is unfair or wrong, and you have no path to fix that, what is the point of developing skills? What's the point of feeling like you're good at your job? And democratization requires knowledge, and algorithmic management limits that kind of knowledge building pathway. And then lastly, relatedness. In both gig economy and traditional work, algorithmic management and surveillance limit employees' ability to develop relationships in the workplace, both between managers and their employees and between employees themselves. I think surveillance is really key here. So if we're talking about algorithmic management in terms of both the algorithms themselves and the underlying surveillance, which collects data, the surveillance leads to workers not being able to communicate freely with each other, develop close relationships. That directly implicates your ability to develop relatedness in the workplace. And so in the cases of like communications monitoring, so the example that I give is Amazon monitoring worker chats, right? So Amazon was monitoring worker chats for phrases like union, shockingly, and you feel as though you cannot be your full and authentic self and express your full opinions at work. How are you going to build a relationship with your coworkers if you know that you're being subject to surveillance? And transparency in particular in this case, even again, if you know that you're being subject to an algorithm, if you understand how that algorithm works, it doesn't stop the harmful effects of the surveillance of the data collection that goes underneath it. Also, visible performance management or scoring triggers a lot of competition, and that impedes connection building as well. Karen Levy, if you haven't read it, wrote a really fascinating book called Data Driven, and it was an ethnographic study of truck drivers in the United States. And she found that the truck drivers that were subject to monitoring systems and performance systems, where there was essentially a scoreboard for like who was driving this, not the safest, but like the most effectively, or who had the most miles or who had the most overtime, they reported increased competitiveness, but also, interestingly, there was this whole system of truck driver kind of information sharing pathways where they would talk about the best routes or the best scales to go to. There was all this ingrained knowledge, and when these performance monitoring algorithms came into play and the surveillance that underpinned them came into play, they stopped sharing that information with each other. So they stopped being able to develop relatedness at work with their other coworkers because they felt like they were in competition, and they felt, instead of feeling like they were part of a collective good, they felt like they were in competition. The other part, which I didn't get into as much in this paper, but I think is really important, is that algorithmic management, and particularly surveillance, disrupts things like unions. A lot of the times it's deployed for the purposes of breaking up unions, breaking up nascent collective action organization, because companies don't want that. And at the end of the day, that's I think a big pathway through which democratization at work takes place, is through things like collective action and collective bargaining. So relatedness is key to the people-centric process of democracy. Without this ability to feel related to other citizens, the democratic processes break down due to lack of trust. If I feel like my coworkers and I don't know each other, how do I feel like I want to participate in a system with which we can exert agency or design what happens to us at work? If I feel like they're my competition, that's just not going to happen. So in a practical sense, I think a really important limitation of the way that regulation has been phrased currently is that regulators tend to argue for transparency as a remedy for both negative effects and as a way to further democratize AI. The EU AI Act has a huge focus on transparency. So, making sure people know that they're subject to high risk. And algorithmic management shows up in the high risk category. It's actually one of the things that the AI Act specifically talks about, as algorithms at work. They're making sure that people are subject to them, making sure the outputs are understandable by humans, making sure the inputs are understandable, etc. But the transparency regulations, especially in the context of work, don't necessarily address this power imbalance, the negative effects of surveillance, or that process of democratization. So I don't think it's a panacea, and I think that it's really important for regulators to understand that, particularly in a high-risk case like at work, where the impacts and the effects of the kinds of decisions that these algorithms are making or feeding into are very high stakes because they have to do with people's lives and livelihoods. That goal of democratization would be better addressed by regulations that include really strong accountability mechanisms and also the minimization of worker data collection. I think it's going to be really important to understand that these things go hand in hand, right? It's not just knowing that you're being subject to an algorithm, but it's also making sure that the data that's collected, which underlies that algorithm, is collected, knowingly with consent. There's not emission creep there, and that it's not used for other purposes, nefarious purposes. So, yeah, that's my presentation.
Thank you very much. Anyone has any question? Yes.
So it's similar to the presentation that we had on facial recognition.
Mm-hmm.
Is the solution for algorithms used in workplaces to make the algorithms better and to help do things like improve relatedness and feelings of competence, or is the solution really to say let's stop using these in the workplace?
I think, it's interesting. The unions have taken a tact in a lot of ways to say, let's stop using these at all. But I just don't think that that's feasible, to be quite honest with you. I think a lot of the times these algorithms are so embedded in the way that these work practices exist. So if you take a factory, for example, right, an Amazon warehouse is going to want to optimize their ability to pick and pack things because it directly leads to their profit. Telling them that they can't do that, or workers saying, we don't want this to happen, it's not going to stop them. I think, and feasibly, that kind of regulation is just not going to exist. Even California wasn't able to pass that kind of regulation. All they were able to pass is notification of quotas. So, I mean, yes, in an ideal world, I think it would be great not to be subject to algorithms at work, but in the present, and with the way, with the goal of democratization, if the goal here is to have employees to be able to have a say in what kinds of things happen at work, then I think that we need to think firstly about accountability, right? So when decisions are made and they harm workers, and those decisions are based on algorithmic outputs, what is the accountability? You don't have a human to go to, so where does that liability and accountability lie? And then secondarily, I think, not necessarily improving the algorithms, but I think that in addition to that accountability point, I do think it's important that workers have a say in what kind of data is collected. So there's a lot of cases where, the employers will mandate things that are very privacy invasive. So I remember reading one case where it was a poultry processing factory, and they made their workers wear smartwatches to track their physical movements, to track their productivity through physical movements. And the workers were not unionized, and they didn't feel as though they had a say until the public backlash came out after the article was published, that this was not okay at work. The other thing is, that kind of technology, if you're given it at work, very easily creeps into the home context, creates all kinds of feelings of dehumanization. So I think that the other big underlying point here, not necessarily making the algorithms better, but understanding the exploitative practice of where that data that underlies them comes from. And also recognizing that some workers may want to opt into things like productivity tracking or performance management, but that process is always going to be mediated by the employer-employee relationship. So I just think it's a special case that we kind of have to put outside of, I think about it akin to occupational health and safety, actually, is one way to do it. So you don't have to go into work and argue for your right not to be exposed to toxic chemicals anymore. That's like since, not that long ago you had to, but since the 70s or so, you don't have to go into work and think about that. It's an affirmative duty on the employer to protect their employee. I think it should be the same with these kinds of technologies. It should be an affirmative duty to protect their employees, not the employees having to come into work and say, we don't want to be subject to this. Please don't make us subject to this. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing presentation. Thank you. My question is about thinking about the possibilities of coalition building. So you really excellently highlighted how transparency-based regulations might fail to account for the particularities of algorithmic management surrounds workplace. But I'm wondering, especially if we're thinking about the ways in which many of the same algorithms that are used in workplace or same technologies, they're used in workplaces that are now kind of having a function creep in some ways, right? Where they're also now being used by different states in state sanctioned surveillance projects, or in academics classrooms with Proctorio or software, or just that there's so many ways in which this algorithmic surveillance is impacting differentially marginalized people around the world. So what are the possibilities for coalition building while still attempting to particularities in each case?
I think we're in such early phases, particularly because white-collar workers are just starting to realize that they're subject to these kinds of things. And so there's a lot of coalition to be built, even within the labor movement itself, about the importance of limiting algorithmic management and limiting surveillance at work, just because it wasn't really as possible. So I had a very interesting interview with this guy from a union, and he said something about basically the workers on the shop floor have been being monitored for as long as the shop floor has existed. If you're a computer programmer, you probably don't think that's the case. You've never considered yourself to be a quote, quote, victim of something like that happening. So I think first we got to build coalition within the labor movement itself. And I also think because labor law is a kind of particular way to address some of these issues, that it does have to be narrowed in scope a bit. But I think you're right. It's really important to have open conversations about surveillance and about the psychological impacts of surveillance and about the problems with, the kinds of algorithms that exist. The more that people know about them, I think the better, because to even advocate for yourself at work, to advocate through your labor rights or through collective action, you do have to have that underlying knowledge. So I feel like it's maybe a little, I don't want to say too early, but I think that it's good to build a wide coalition, but in the workplace context in particular, given that your instrument is labor law and it's kind of limited, there is a limitation there.
That makes sense. Yeah. Sorry. One thing I just thought of in response to what you said. I recently read this article called Origin Stories and Computations, Computers and Industrial Control by Meredith Whitaker, and she's trying to argue that thinking about industrial control directly draws on the lines of slavery and plantation management, and you can't really divorce this question of labor surveillance without thinking about the violence of slavery.
Yeah.
How Charles Fox literally developed the computer and computation of industrial control.
Well, so I reference algorithm management as kind of digital Taylorism. Yeah. Friedrich Taylor, wild racist, so it's all connected. I think that's so, first of all, I love Meredith Whitaker. She's my queen. But yeah, it's so interconnected. And you think about the types of surveillance that happens. The examples that I mentioned that are particularly bad are happening to low wage, predominantly minority workers. Who works at the Amazon warehouse? It's not people that look like me mostly. It's mostly people that don't look like me that, do not have the agency or ability to find quote unquote white collar jobs. So I think it's very important to highlight those voices. That's one thing that I love some of what this work is doing is really starting to come in and highlight the voices of those marginalized workers. I think in a similar way to what we talked about with the tech coalition today, you have people who are in white collar positions who have a lot more power in some ways, who have a lot more voice, needing to lend that voice to the experiences of workers who face marginalization in other ways, right? Economically, racially. But at the same time, you have to understand that these issues affect us all. Yeah. But I think I read the article, but you're gonna need to send that to me also. Yeah.
Yeah, only one question.
Yeah.
Really quick. So alongside the EU AI Act, there's also the directive on platform work. I think maybe speak through it and specifically addresses algorithmic management. My brief understanding of that is it's quite focused on transparency as well.
Yeah.
The comparison between how to address it.
Yeah, and the lawsuits too that have come through. Actually, there was one in Italy and one in Spain, I think, that have come through against Deliveroo and some of these gig providers, some of these platforms. Have also been focused on things like transparency, or they focused on equity, but in an Equality Act sense, where they said that they were being discriminatory based on, I think it was gender. I don't know why the EU is so into that. It's an interesting and strange, I think it's a good first step. It's good to know that you're being subject to these things, but it just doesn't, it's the whole thrust of this, is it doesn't really fix anything. But yeah, the AI Act has been like that. The UK's focus has largely been like that, although the TUC, their major trade union, is currently drafting a bill, and I think they're trying to focus on accountability mechanisms as well. And then the Platform Work Directive. I mean, it's one thing to know that your rights are being violated, but it's another thing to have something to do about it. So, cool.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mariana Paulina Castillo Eruzilla, and she presents her paper about breaking the filter lens, a feminist explanation of beauty ideas in augmented reality filters.
Or do you need it split? Oh, this is in German, I think. Yeah, we have this here. This is how to change this. Try it. Can we change it with this? Maybe to like this. Ah, great. Yeah. Super. Well, hello everyone. Well, we're very glad to be here. My name is Mariana Castillo Mosilla, and today we are going to be presenting our paper, as you already mentioned, by breaking the work in progress rater, creating the filter-less feminist examination of beauty ideals in augmented reality filters. Today here we are with Henrietta Yevi and also Victoria Williams, and we did this submission with the Ethics and Critical Theories of AR Research Group and also the Data Ethics Outreach Lab at Osnabrück Group University. So, today we aim to inspire a theoretical exploration of the political and personal implications of beauty ideals in the digital age. To lay like a foundation for future discussions regarding practices and also regulations about these technologies. And also in light of the presence of sexist AI, for example, sex robots and also AI influencers, Hedy will talk about that later. We advocate for heightening awareness of women issues within the discourse of AI development. So to make this, we analyze face filters and more specifically beauty filters, adding a structural analysis while stressing how their impact goes beyond the realm of social media. Also, a brief point, like, although we acknowledge that the social structures and beauty ideals not only impact the experience of women, because of the lack of space we had, we decided to focus on this specific group because other social groups, of course, they suffer oppression from these same norms in different ways. So we decided to focus here. So, what are face filters? In case you don't know, here we have some videos to show it. So basically, face filters or augmented reality filters are automated tools that use computer vision, between other things, to detect and modify facial features, as you can see in these videos. They also introduced the possibility to the real-time customization of facial features. That was something that didn't existed before face filters. That's why we kind of like want to focus on this, and more than focusing in the way the way they work specifically, we want to discuss how they have taken the normalization of beauty to the next level by enabling users to conform to beauty ideals just by one click. As you can see these videos, there are a lot of filters, some of them are funny, but we are not going to talk about those. We want to talk about these ones, the beauty ones. Yeah, that as you can see, they normally conform to normative beauty ideals about women. So they are very trending among young girls and women. And as you can see, they become super realistic. There is one moment when I put my hand in front of my face, and it doesn't change. So they have taken the technology like very impressively further. So beauty filters are only seemingly harmless. However, they have been already criticized for perpetuating racism by reinforcing Eurocentric and heteronormative beauty ideals. As you can see also in these videos, they tend to turn the skin lighter of the people and also shape the facial features of people accordingly to these normative beauty ideals, showing them as the only features considered beautiful in our society. And we argue for this same reason that not only invisibilize other social groups, but also endorse diversity among women, not only inside the virtual space, but also outside the digital space. So, yeah, as I said, we argue that this effect goes beyond the realm of social media and the digital space, because they add to the shaping of the way we experience our body and also change the way people behave outside the digital space. Hedy will go deeper into that. But what I wanted to show you is some evidence we find regarding mental health, of the effect of the overexposure to perfect images, and also what social media have caused in women and young women and young girls. For example, it has been already said, that the overexposure to perfect images raises the self-image disorders, such as, for example, eating disorders and body dysmorphic disorders. Specifically related with face filters, cosmetic surgery, coined this term, Snapchat dysmorphia, to talk about this new phenomenon that is appearing, that people goes to get cosmetic procedures, now showing a picture of themselves filtered instead of showing a picture of a celebrity that used to happen in the past. And also, it's been stated at Yale that this generation now have developed new visual skills to assess their own image, practicing nanosurveillance of their bodies, to identify very precisely and sharply imperfections in their faces and bodies. And what I want to show you here, one filter that we argue that kind of like add to this phenomenon. It was called Fix Me Filter, yeah, it was called like that, for real, and it was banned hopefully by Facebook in 2019 because people argue that promotes to get people cosmetic procedures because it shows the face of the people who use it as how a surgeon will draw in your face to fix your face. Yeah, so we argue that also adds to this amplifying pressure to self-optimization and also normalize cosmetic surgeries, among other things. And now Hedy will continue with our structural analysis about the situation.
Yes, thank you. Next slide. No, not this slide. This slide. Yeah, thank you. So we want to discuss these technologies from a more broader, social perspective. So we want to set into context all the empirical findings because we want to ask ourselves, why is it that such filters have such a big effect and so much power? It is kind of intuitive that we know, okay, they play into beauty ideals, and we also kind of take it as a given that yes, okay, we know beauty ideals do cause pain in women and girls, but we really want to look deeper into that because the fact that we normalize it also kind of hints at the social structures at play. So yeah, that's why we think it's worth reminding ourselves that there is a social, cultural context that gives rise to these things, thereby these technologies, these technologies are not developed in a vacuum. So we just also want to say that we're not doing a sociological study, we're really talking about beauty filters here, but we do want to, with our talk, our aim is to highlight the role of that social context, not only to understand the technology better, itself better, but also develop a kind of outlook that improves our critical reflection so that we can judge all kinds of technologies that are also developed within that context. So we put the things that we already know, about the psychological harm caused in individuals in a more all-encompassing perspective and way. So yeah, again, beauty filters aren't developed in a vacuum, and we actually argue that they perpetuate structural misogyny. As we heard yesterday also in the talk about deepfake pornography, the media portrayal of women is largely sexually objectifying. We also put a compilation of videos of these are advertisements and depictions, media depictions of women in movies and TV series. Think this compilation kind of makes our point. And yeah, it is the context that beauty filters are developed in. And technologies have also contributed to the sexual objectification. Historically, cameras have heightened the focus on visual depictions of women. Social media platforms do the same thing, and face filters are just, our argument is that face filters are the new thing on top of that. Though we do acknowledge that beauty filters and face filters do kind of pose a new layer of complexity because of the 3D modeling and the whole, one could look into the embodied phenomenological aspect of it because you move your face, you change face, and it kind of it is another kind of perspective one needs to take. But overall, when it comes to the social context, this is the new thing. So this kind of objectifying media, of course, it shapes the view of women, and for women also it shapes the view of yourself, and also shapes your perception in virtue of the confrontation with these things. So when it comes to beauty filters, a confrontation with these beautified images and the interaction with the technology. That's why we argue that beauty filters are actually a result and a further intensifier of misogyny, because again, they normalize all these things. So these beauty filters exactly play into like these beautified, also often like sexualized looks. That's why, like, that's kind of like crudely put, that's why they're objectifying. You see, you will use something like a beauty filter on your face, and it will become more intuitive to see your face or your body as an object to be looked at, perceived from the outside, and you can decorate it directly or shape it, and you will shape it accordingly. And as also empirical evidence and empirical studies have shown, this amplifies self-consciousness and self-objectification. Now, thank you. Now, well, if the world is like that, if you self-objectify, then it only makes sense that you have a desire to use these beauty filters. So yesterday, again, we're drawing a lot from the references with the talk on deepfake pornography. We kind of problematized involuntary curation of an online appearance. With this talk, we want to problematize voluntary adherence or voluntary distortion of your own face, kind of, or like a, I don't know, change in your online appearance, voluntary filter use, basically. So, filters, these beauty filters are so very easily accessible through the comfort of your smartphone. You can just click on something and change it easily. Most of them are fun. They're supposed to be like something that you like to use. But really, we want to question the free choice here, because if this is the context they're developed in, this is the media portrayal of women, and if women are in fact primarily evaluated based on their sexual attractiveness, how meaningful is it to assert that these filters are like something harmless that you choose to do for fun, choose to do freely? So we argue that it's not just outer social pressure that makes people use beauty filters, but there's also internal pressure that's amplified. And this subjugation, we argue, is even bigger and even more problematic because you choose to do something. It's hard to delineate. There's no direct demands on you. It reinforces self-surveillance and a desire for conformity. There are also further cultural aspects to consider, like in marketing, adhering to beauty ideals is something that is sold to you. Or even if there is any kind of self-awareness, because nowadays, like in media, there's a lot of body positivity kind of talk. So self-awareness of the negative consequences of beauty ideals are still reverted and again sold back to you. The narrative is like, oh, you feel bad about your body. Why don't you take care of yourself to feel more confident? And by take care of yourself is like basically again conform to the ideals in one way or another. You just need to be more confident is kind of the narrative, and we would argue it's a bit of more of an individualistic lens of looking at it. Oh, you feel bad, you can be more confident. This is basically what I guess we also all know what the beauty and cosmetic industry does. You can also see on the poster, this is like an advertisement for cosmetic surgery. It's framed as like you can pursue cosmetic surgery to boost your confidence, basically. So this is like, do some self-care, love yourself, these kind of things. And this is not yet. This is the kind of narrative that also social media platforms or beauty filter apps, they just repeat the same thing. They employ the same thing. So here, use our filter to feel good about yourself. So they likewise, need to make money. So this distortion of reality that you've seen with the filters is highly incentivized. These platforms are designed in a way to be addictive. So through further exposure, they're addictive. You use them more and more, so you're exposed to these filters more and more. And because of this exposure, the interaction with the technology, this whole cultural understanding of what adhering to beauty ideal means, the user is more inclined to use them. And this is a good business strategy for the social media platforms or any other apps to offer them. So it's like just classic marketing, make the people more insecure. And then you provide, there is a demand for it, so you provide this. It's, we argue that this is just another kind of exploitation. That's why we say social media platforms exploit insecurities for profit. Yes, that was our talk. We just very quickly summarize our takeaways. So the argument here is that beauty filters increase the ongoing objectification of women as well as self-objectification. Thereby, they perpetuate ongoing misogyny, but also they perpetuate ongoing racism. And also not to forget that it's all embedded in a capitalistic kind of context. So social media platforms and beauty filters capitalize on our inclination for social participation and insecurities and creative desires. So yeah, we put in there, given all of this, are really free to choose, like considering that more and more of our lives is outlet in the digital sphere. There's like development of VR environments, of metaverse and whatnot. More people use social media. If everyone uses them, then do you really have a choice? Because if you want to keep up with everyone in the digital sphere, then you will feel pressure to use them or you will want to use them. And also given that our focus is on women's issues in discussing AI development, we also put this example, like just to again highlight the importance of discussing women's issues. These like pictures that you see, is the video stuck? I think it's stuck. Yeah. These pictures that you see, these are not real women. These are AI generated women. As you can see, they look, maybe this one is not the most realistic, but the other ones look even more realistic, and they're also, these pictures are very highly sexualized. So yeah, this is just something else that's supposed to, that's supporting our point. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention. We're looking forward to discussing with you.
So first, I wanted to say thank you so much for this presentation. This topic is right up my alley. I love it because I'm also interested. I used to research a bit about AI and advertising in fashion, looking also at fashion theory and human rights. And now I'm also very much interested in deepfake technology and how it's used in fashion. And I guess one question I always stumble across, even though I know that there's this importance of there is an inherent limitation these technologies perpetuate on our own development of identities, I would frame. But then people ask, yeah, but where's the harm? And especially with psychological harm, it's very difficult to prove, even though I guess we need more, will be more legislation that focus on more the impact of manipulation, but still, it's a really big challenge. How would you address this challenge? I personally don't know, but yeah, I was wondering just out of interest, how do you respond to that?
That's something that we ask ourselves. That's what we were trying to bring across, that they are seen as this harmless, fun technology, and also basically, okay, this could be, we would always argue, if you think there's no harm and it's just some people feel bad, that's just not a broad enough view of what the problem actually is. It adds onto a specific kind of culture. It, as we would argue, perpetuates misogyny. And the effect, I think the most intuitive or easiest thing to talk about would to just maybe talk about psychological harms that are done. Yeah, they are hard to prove, but this is the most intuitive thing to point towards, because the real discussion is much more broad and entangled with other kinds of social structures. So yeah, I don't know if you want to add on to that.
Yeah, no, actually, I don't know if it's adding, but maybe to continue in the same line, I think that's why we argue that, because of course there are a lot of studies that argue that this kind of technologies cause harm, and they're this kind of, actually we find a lot related with anxiety, depression, a lot of different, but it seems like if we have this narrow view about the individual effects of these technologies, we are not able to see the big image. That's why we argue to add this structural analysis, because they kind of give us more support in order to see it seems like this is not only related with personal features, but it's also society. It's made in a way that shows this. So,
yeah, that's why we added the AI generated influencers, because it's a different technology, but it's related to beauty filters still.
And social media.
Yeah, I fully agree with you.
Super.
I would like to know if you see that all this kind of angst that you described in a certain kind of way could be transferred also in the metaverse.
In the metaverse.
Yeah, in such a way that, I'm afraid that the platform, the algorithm on the platform start to suggest identity trait that amplify hypersocialization in order to maximize engagement on the platform and all the kind of dynamics that we already observed in traditional social media. You see that there are reasons to suspect that this kind of dynamic will be replaced also in this new evolution of the platform.
Actually, well, I don't know you, and I will say like I don't have too much information regarding metaverse because actually I'm not into that either. But maybe based on our own research, and that's why we kind of like propose this more structural, like feminist analysis of the situation, because it seems like the only way. Well, we argue like the way to understand how we need to go a step like back. Like say that's why we say like it's not like face filters are causing this, but they are like products, but also perpetuators of these dynamics. And so we need to go before, and I think one of the presentations also talked about that, like which are the social relationships, social structures, like social like mandates that are behind the development of this type of technologies. Because you see, it's like if we don't criticize that, it's easy that these technologies at the end perpetuates the same dynamics. Like I think, and in that sense, I would say like, yeah, if we don't criticize like the structures behind them, of course, probably it's going to be replicated in the metaverse and also other types of technologies. Yeah.
I mean, we chose beauty fillers as an example to discuss the sexual objectification of women through AI technologies. If the metaverse could be, I mean, it sounds super intuitive that it's can perpetuate the same kind of things and mechanisms, maybe even worse because you're just so embedded in it. I'm not sure what the metaverse is really supposed to be, but I imagine some kind of VR 3D environment, so it looks more normal, looks more natural. Probably it adds another layer to it. Yeah.
So maybe we have time for a question.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. So, assuming that there are other like model of filters that represent different type of beauty, I mean, not the standard one. Do you think that this sense of amplified pressure for self-optimization will persist, or other forms of beauty expressed in this form of filters will, in some ways, will say solve the problem?
Yeah, I can answer that. I think, yeah, I mean, our point is not that there is just one kind of beauty and it's exclusive. We're critiquing the system of beauty itself being oppressive. So even if it's supposed to be more inclusive, you need to find a way to adhere to certain standards they can become. I mean, now that's why we kind of brought up, now there is some self-awareness in media. There's body positivity. You can be beautiful in any size. You can be beautiful with any hair color, skin color, whatever. I mean, first off, we think that beauty is not just like a category itself, it's tied to other like social structures. So if there's racism in like even outside of the beauty system, say, then of course there is also still racism within the beauty industry anyway, even if the media acts as if there isn't. And even, I mean, just saying that, okay, no matter what, you can still be beautiful, we wouldn't say it's enough. You shouldn't have to be beautiful.
Exactly. Yeah, and maybe to add to what you were just saying, like maybe I would question like back, like why would we need in the first moment to align to certain beauty ideals? Like maybe that's why I'm putting like this slide, because it's kind of like I think it's like a more complex discussion. It's not like we need to go further maybe and ask ourselves like what is behind this and what is behind these norms. So, yeah. So that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next speaker is Nicola Palladino. And he presents a paper about generalizing AI insights from societal, constitutionalism, and artificial intelligence studies.
Okay. I'm Nicola Palladino, taxi organizer for the opportunity to share with you my this work in progress. Well, basically, today I'm going to present you theoretical framework to reason about democratization of AI in terms of the safeguard of fundamental rights. And to do that, I will rely mostly on the Günther Koebner's social constitutionalism theory, that is basically an attempt to understand constitutionalization from a social system perspective. In this view, the more a social subsystem become autonomous, the more it develops rules, institution, and including also means of communication that can be considered as the institution that allow for interaction with the subsystem, make this interaction possible and meaningful. And then there is also a specific logic of the system that define how this subsystem function. And the more a subsystem become important for the whole society because it carry out a crucial function, the more it can give rise to what Teubner calls expansionistic and totalizing tendencies, that mean that the subsystem could exploit individuals and community in order to reproduce itself and its own logic. Just to give an example, to make this more concrete, if we consider the economic subsystem, in this case, we can say that the means of communication is money. The money is what makes interaction in the economic system meaningful and valuable for all the actors. The system logic stick to the commodification. And as expansionistic tendencies, we can mention, exploitation of the workforces, but also alienation or pollution, because that subsystem tend to exploit all their social sphere to reproduce itself. In this view, the constitutionalization of a social system occur when the friction with individual and community or other social sphere lead to creation of constitutive and limitative rules that are rules that, on the one hand, allow for unleash the specific potential of the subsystem, but on the other hand, they try to create some kind of constraint in order to avoid the subsystem can endanger people and communities. And this constitutive and limitative rule also include the fundamental rights that have the inclusionary exclusionary function, where the inclusionary function means that this right allow people to access to the mean of communication, the specific mean of communication on that subsystem. And exclusionary right means that this kind of rule sets the boundaries of what could be considered a legitimate operation of the subsystem. And most important for this kind of theory, fundamental right to be effective need to be translated in the specific means of communication of that subsystem. This process of rule making must be considered as a hybrid process of governance, meaning that it involves different kind of actors, each of them with different rules and responsibilities. Okay, in this view, we can consider the digital world of you prefer information society or the infosphere as a social subsystem that has become, in the last decades, more and more autonomous and relevant for the whole society. And here, the means of communication could be considered as the code. Intended according to the conceptualization of Lawrence Lessig in the called the law of the cyberspace as a socio-technical architecture that combines software, hardware, and human interaction and make the interaction between different social actors in the digital world possible. And the resulting logic is digitalization. That should be considered as a process through which social life is increasingly translated and transformed into digital information to be processed and analyzed in order to extract further information and added value. And in this sense, well, the expansionistic tendencies could be identified, described in terms of surveillance, manipulation, but also some side negative consequences of automated decision making. Well, now the constitutionalization of the digital subsystem, then also artificial intelligence, require the development of the following type of rules that we can obtain by combining constitutive rules or limitative rules with a safeguard on the one hand of the autonomy and integrity of the subsystem itself, and on the other hand, with the safeguard of the autonomy and integrity of individuals and community. Well, so first we can now talk about coding rules. They are the rules stemming from the logic of programming languages, statistical methods, software, and hardware specification that you have to follow to make an artificial intelligence system function. And it's worth noting that also the other kind of fundamental rights need to be translated into these kind of rules to be actually effective. Then we have a security rule, aiming at ensuring the stability, reliability, and resilience of artificial intelligence system. For example, they include access control measures, encryption protocols, data authentication processes, and intrusion detection mechanism. And by combining limitative function and human right, we arrive at the domain of exclusionary right. These rules are designed to safeguard individuals from the potentially exploitative tendencies of artificial intelligence system by establishing the limit of their legitimate operation. And these rules may refer to areas of privacy, fairness, safety, and finally, the intersection between human rights and constitutive function gives rise to the area of inclusionary rights. The rights aimed at ensuring social shaping and people control over AI development, and inclusionary rights include the norms related to transparency, traceability, explainability, and accountability, and also human oversight. In this sense, trustworthiness became a crucial concept to describe fundamental right into the logic of digitalization, because we need to consider fundamental rights as something that is necessary to create digital technology that could be trusted, and then to avoid the rejection of the digitalization process, and also loss of opportunities because the people don't trust, for example, artificial intelligence systems. I said before, digital constitutionalization is an hybrid process in which the external pressure exercised by a plurality of factors lead artificial intelligence system provider to introduce self-limitation mechanisms. And very briefly, we can say that, for example, states and other public decision makers are the most qualified subject to determine what are the values that should be embedded within the architecture of artificial intelligence system, and what are the kind of requirements that have to comply with because of their authority and democratic legitimacy. Then we have international organizations that can play a pivotal role in ensuring that the rules established by state do not differ too much each other. And so this is really relevant to avoid to put in danger the global supply chain that's related to AI development, but also to avoid some cherry-picking attitude between the different regulatory regimes. And then we have the technical communities that, with their expertise, are not only the best placed, but they have the sole ability to understand the effect and impact of certain technical specification. And they are also able to translate principles, rights, and values into workable arrangement that could be implemented at the operational level. And they also play a crucial role in the assessment of the compliance of AI system with established requirement. Then we have also media public opinion that can play a significant role to the extent that they manage to politicize the implication of certain technical choice. They can create awareness, they can prompt public intervention and exert pressure on AI providers, and they can also act transforming the protection of fundamental rights into a determinant of user or consumer behavior that could start to create another pressure for AI providers to implement some fundamental rights safeguard. Think about what's happening with privacy, that becomes something that have economic and commercial value. And of course, all the previous actors could provide requirement, guidelines, and rules, but most of the effort in implementing this input into workable and operational arrangements fall back on the organization to develop, deploy, and manage artificial intelligence technologies. And here we can say very briefly the management have their responsibility to define what are the AI system requirements according to regulations, stakeholder expectation, business need, to set internal, external accountability mechanism and provide also oversight. While the technical teams need to find the most proper way to implement these principles. And to conclude, I will just briefly illustrate how the Artificial Intelligence Act could be considered as an example of digital constitutionalization. Indeed, the Artificial Intelligence Act provides a series of exclusionary rights consisting in the provision of certain types of application deemed incompatible with the values of the European Union and human rights, for example, biometric recognition system, manipulative or discriminatory application, social scoring system, and the Artificial Intelligence Act also established some specific requirement for high-risk artificial intelligence application, such as risk management, quality control, data governance, mechanism for human oversight that all can contribute to ensure that artificial systems do not endanger people and community, but also provide a series of inclusionary rights that ensure the access to the code, as we intended before, throughout a series of transparency, traceability, and human oversight measures. And also entail security rules when we talk about cybersecurity and robustness. But above all, the Artificial Intelligence Act seems to depict an hybrid constitutionalization process throughout which constitutive and limitative rules are translated into code and embedded in the socio-technical structure of artificial intelligence system throughout the establishment of mechanisms to create harmonized standard and realize conformity assessment. Well, I'm running out of time, so just jump at the last slide. Well, I think this mechanism of providing, establishing a mechanism to develop standard could be a good strategy because it can ensure that the regulation do not become outdated in a short time or could be circumvented by another technological innovation. But at the same time, the hybrid nature of this constitutionalization process also consider a darker side that is the risk of capture by special interests. Indeed, we know that within this standard setting organization, the private sector company could play a very important role setting the process in order to soften the regulation requirement and try to undermine their responsibilities. And to mitigate the risk, I think that public decision makers should develop in-house expertise and competencies to evaluate the adequateness of harmonized standard technical specification. And we need also effort to foster a broad awareness of the social political implication and impacts of artificial intelligence specification, and so that we can encourage public opinion to politicize the value and political goals to be incorporated in the AI such a technical architecture, and also in order to make the individuals that work and create this kind of technology more accountable for the consequences of the work. And I think it's what basically we also contribute to do today with our discussion and presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Anyone has any question? Okay, maybe I have one.
Yeah.
So about this process of digital constitutionalism, you did an example of the EU Act, EU AI Act. There are any other act or any other tries to to do something similar in other parts of the world, so for example in the US or in Asia, that you can consider digital constitutionalism, or only EU is doing something like that?
Yeah, basically the European Union is the actor that is much involved in this kind of process and that is proposing the most advanced kind of regulation, but also that is coupled also with the other initiatives that can go into this direction. The recent executive order on AI that has been released by the US presidency also introduced some element of digital constitutionalism, but is also go along with an attempt to promote the employment of this technology in sectors such as justice, defense, that do not come along with safeguard that can prevent a fundamental right violation. And so now that for this reason, I think that the European Union is the most advanced example of this process. Even if, this is a process, it's not exactly, it's also a question of grade. So we cannot talk about a process is complete. We can identify elements here and there of digital constitutionalization, but we know, yes, there's a lot of things to do. Yeah.
Anyone has